This story will be removed from Wattpad on August 3, 2023. Did you know Imogen's a dancer? Against my will, Tabitha hauled me back into the conversation with the three guys sharing our table. Coming to this club with Eleanor and Tabitha had seemed like a great idea earlier this evening. Loud music to drown out my nagging thoughts, dancing with attractive guys to distract me from a man who now only existed in my memories, and two friends who reminded me of simpler times when the music, dancing and cheap alcohol could solve any problem. A dancer, huh? The guy beside me said, his eyes sweeping over my body. How much do you charge? His two companions cackled, as if their friend hadn't just recycled an overused line that I'd heard 100 times before. You wouldn't be able to afford me, I said, mirroring his actions by dragging my gaze from his eyes downwards. An equally predictable response, but then the guy didn't seem interested in originality. Tabitha, however, was not impressed. A ballroom dancer, she added with a rush of urgency, shooting me a glare. Apparently unfazed by my attempt to put him back in his place, the guy pushed on. A ballroom dancer? Can't imagine that. You're far too sexy to be prancing about with some stuck-up guy who's barely allowed to touch you. It was a pity I didn't find blind ignorance endearing, otherwise I'd have been back at his flat already rather than listening to him talk shit. She does Latin, too, Eleanor said. I narrowed my eyes at her, but she didn't take the hint. It couldn't be more obvious that Eleanor and Tabitha wanted me to hit it off with the guy. They'd already set their sights on his two friends, and although they were a good-looking bunch, I wasn't in the mood. I'm going to the bathroom, I said, easing myself out from behind the table and then resting my eyes on the comedian next to me. Why don't you get another round in? See, I was making an effort with him. Tabitha and Eleanor scurried after me, wasting no time and launching into their attack as soon as we joined the queue for the ladies' bathroom. For fuck's sake, Imogen. What's wrong with you tonight? Must we do all the work for you? Tabitha asked. I'd rather you didn't do any work for me. I could not be less interested in that guy. Away from the thumping music and flashing lights of the main floor, we could talk much more easily, not that that would be a good thing if all they intended to do was give me a hard time. But Bryce is hot. You never turned down a jaw that chiseled or arms that big. First time for everything, I said, deadpan. Eleanor rolled her eyes. You need to get over that loser you met on holiday. He doesn't give a shit about you, Immy. No calls. No texts. Nothing. So why are you turning your nose up at hunks like Bryce? 2 months ago, you'd have been grinding on his lap. Despite her brutal manner of delivering it, she spoke the truth. Jason hadn't called me after we returned from a summer of mind-blowing sex in Greece. He hadn't even sent a message. 3 weeks on, it was starting to feel like he'd been nothing but a figment of my imagination. But no. It would be impossible to imagine sex as good as that. Jason's bedroom skills far surpassed any guy I'd been with before, and I doubted anyone would ever match him going forwards, too. Certainly not Bryce, despite his chiseled jaw and big arms. Why even bother sleeping with him when all I'd achieved was a reminder of how good I'd had it in Greece? Look, we really like his two friends, Tabitha said. But Bryce is clearly the one who calls the shots, and you know how it is. Okay, girls. Maybe I'm still caught up on Jason, but that is not stopping you from going home with those boys. I don't need to hold your hand or be the one to suggest it. If you want to sleep with them, then do it. The queue had moved forwards until we were almost in the bathroom, and a few women at the sinks turned upon hearing my raised voice. Tabitha and Eleanor flushed and lowered their heads, obviously not comfortable with the rest of the toilets hearing how they lacked the confidence to pursue a one-night stand without their friends' encouragement. A toilet became vacant, and Tabitha and Eleanor headed towards it, turning at the last minute to look at me. Eleanor tapped her finger against her bag and jerked her head towards the cubicle. I declined. Not even Jason Walters could tempt me back into that. The following Monday, as I got ready for my first day at work, the message arrived. Jason Walters. Good luck with your first day. X. I stared at it, temporarily distracted from applying my mascara. When the screen timed out, I flipped the phone onto its front to hide any further notifications. I'd had the chance to revisit the past in the club at the weekend, one last blowout before doing something serious with my life. Instead, a night that would have been the perfect source of entertainment 2 months ago had ended with me leaving before midnight, while my two usually more cautious friends opted to stay. The whole evening had been more of a reminder of my summer than a distraction. With that in mind, I applied another layer of foundation to mask the freckles that had developed from a month of swimming, sunbathing and sightseeing. If only the makeup could erase the memory of it, too. Greece had been fun, but I'd been reckless. It had just been the pinnacle of a year's worth of careless behavior and stupid choices, really. This new job held promise of a bright career. The time for poor decision-making was over. I ignored the text. It was 3 weeks late, anyway. Are you nervous? The question caught me off guard. Tearing my eyes away from surveying the modern, open-plan office space, I met the friendly gaze of Ian, the company's VP. Should I be? I asked. He smiled and led me through into a small meeting room, leaving the door open. No. First days are easy, right? We discussed what to expect over the first couple of weeks, and then Ian talked me through a series of documents that I needed to complete for HR purposes. It's always the most boring things that are the most crucial, he said, pushing the papers towards me. The director here, for example. Very important. Not very interesting. The twinkle in his eye suggested he was joking, and the wink that followed confirmed it. After we discussed the paperwork, Ian introduced me to my colleagues, reeling off name after name. By the time he'd reached the editorial team, where I'd be working, I'd already forgotten those from sales, customer service, and marketing. And this is Maya Chopra. She'll be your mentor for your first few months here. Maya tucked her shoulder-length hair behind her ear and then thrust her hand forwards, smiling at me. Nice to meet you and welcome to the team. I shook her hand, returning her firm grip. Thanks. It's good to finally start. I bet. These applications take forever. She shot an amused look in Ian's direction and he folded his arms. We'll let you control the process next time, Maya. I'd be happy to. She sat back down and crossed one long leg over the other, interlinking her fingers on the desk in front of her. One more person to introduce you to, and then you can get cracking with Maya, Ian said. She'll look after you. I followed him across the office to a metallic set of double doors built into the far wall. It wasn't until he pressed a button to the side of them, which illuminated green shortly afterwards, that I realized it was a well-concealed lift. Yes? A soft yet authoritative voice spoke through an intercom. It's me, Ian said. You got time for a quick introduction to the new starter? The doors separated, and Ian gestured for me to step inside. I had several questions, but I'd barely opened my mouth before the lift completed its short journey and the doors pulled apart again, revealing a private office. At the far end, directly opposite the lift, a man sat at a glass desk, his head bowed as he stared at his laptop. The director, no doubt. I'd tried searching him online but had found nothing of much use to me apart from articles about his successful business decisions. No photos, no insight into his interests and no background information, nothing to help humanize him before we met. Imogen, I'd like you to meet our company director, Ian said, striding towards the desk with a level of confidence that prompted me to stand up straighter. Jason Stafford. I followed Ian towards the desk, grateful for the director's apparent interest in his laptop screen so I didn't feel like I was walking down a catwalk under judging eyes. When I reached the desk, he snapped his laptop lid shut and stood up, his eyes meeting mine. Eyes that were all too familiar. My stomach clenched as recognition settled within me, horror coursing through my veins followed by another emotion that was beyond inappropriate for the current situation. I let my eyes drift over him, convinced that I must be hallucinating. Tan skin from hours of sunbathing, swimming and sightseeing. A smattering of facial hair now neatly trimmed. A navy, tailored suit that hugged his body, hiding the contours of muscles that I'd ran my hands over time after time after time. Nice to meet you. I'm Jason Stafford. He offered me his hand, his eyes boring into mine yet giving nothing away. There was no acknowledgement that we knew each other, no suggestion that we'd spent the last month in bed together. Remembering that Ian was still present, I extended my own hand and he shook it, his fingers curling around me in a firm grip. The last time he'd held my hand in such a vice-like manner, he'd been pinning it against the bathroom wall as he'd pounded into me mercilessly from behind. I could almost hear the erotic sounds of skin slapping against skin each time his hips met mine, under the torrent of gushing water. Goosebumps prickled my skin, settling between my legs where the tingling intensified. And then I finally caught up with myself. Who the fuck was Jason Stafford? Don't worry, Ian said as we left the lift together a few minutes later. He has that effect on everyone? Excuse me? My time in that room had been a blur, my head unable to focus on anything but how the man behind that desk had spent the summer sending my body into euphoric bliss. The man who hadn't bothered getting in touch after the summer ended. The man who was now my boss. Stunning them into silence. He looks intimidating, I get it. But I promise you'll get used to him. My shock hadn't gone unnoticed, then, but at least Ian thought it was due to me being intimidated by Jason, rather than the sordid, awkward truth. So, does Jason spend all his time up there? I asked, jerking my head back towards the lift. Ian paused before answering. No, not at all. He actually has a desk down here in the main room but uses his office for private meetings and phone calls. I nodded. Got it. Well, thanks for the introduction. I'm sure I'll learn not to be too intimidated by him. Let's run with that lie. Ian had kindly set it up for me, and I clutched at it with determination not to let the truth out. Ian smiled. You'll get to know him in no time at all. Get to know him? I already knew him, although apparently not as well as I'd thought considering he now had a different name. So, are you all set, then? Any questions before I release you into Maya's den? Ian asked. I shook my head. No. Although, if you could point me in the direction of the bathroom, that'd be great. I needed 5 minutes alone to gather my thoughts and come to terms with this horrifying coincidence, and then I could properly dedicate my attention to Maya and focus on getting through my first day. Sure, just continue past the lift and it's the first door on the left, just around the corner. The bathrooms were beautiful, with a marble floor, huge mirrors and flattering lighting, but that only distracted me for a couple of seconds. I braced my hands on the edge of the sink and counted to 10 in my head. Conversations from summer spun around in my mind, but I couldn't pinpoint one that would have warned me that this was about to happen. How could I work for the man who'd spent the summer giving me orgasm after orgasm? How could I see anything but his naked body every time I looked at him? How could I see him as my boss when he knew every little detail about my sexual tastes? Jason Stafford? The bastard had lied about his name. What else had he lied about? Then a chilling realization hit me. What had I lied about? The lift doors pinged, offering a second's notice that someone was about to walk into the office. Not that it mattered. Only one person had the balls to bypass the intercom system and let themselves in. I never should have given you the override code, I said to Ian, not looking up from my laptop. You're just saying that because the only time I use the code is when I know you wouldn't let me in. Exactly, I said through gritted teeth, glancing up at him. I wasn't in the mood for visitors. I had a financial report to review and a recruitment fuck-up to wrap my head around. Both required intense concentration. Both required me to come up with a solution on how to move forwards. It's hard to tell whether you're pissed off or just being your usual stone-cold self, so I'm going to cut to the chase, Ian said, settling down in the chair opposite. Humoring the conversation was usually the best way to get Ian off my back, so I shut the laptop lid and sank back in my seat, folding my arms. Taking that as a signal to continue, Ian launched straight into it. Imogen's the should I girl, isn't she? I narrowed my eyes at him. Pretty sure I've solved that predicament now. Shit. Ian released a long breath, leaning forwards and resting his hands on the desk. He trained his gaze on mine, as if expecting me to expand further. I don't want to talk about it, Ian. It wasn't a hint, it was a clear statement that left no room for misinterpretation. Yet Ian plowed ahead regardless. Have you still not spoken to her since you got back from Greece? I sent her a message this morning. She didn't reply. Is that why you're so pissed off? Because she didn't reply? I tried to keep my frustration at bay. It wasn't Ian's fault that I'd found myself in this position. He did a fantastic job of taking the main brunt of my emotions in the workplace, but this extended beyond business. Of course not. She told me she was starting a new job at a publishing company. Last time I checked, we deal with furniture, not books. And I'm sure you were totally honest with her. Are you here to lecture me, Ian? Because I have a shit ton of work to do. Ian sighed, his gaze softening. No. I'm not. And I'm not here as a colleague either, Jason. I'm here as a friend. You need to talk to her. It's not fair on either of you to pretend nothing's happened, and you owe it to the company not to let this come in the way of business. Shaking my head to myself, I toyed with the edge of my laptop lid. My mind was in turmoil, unable to process that the girl I'd spent the summer with had just been introduced as our new starter. It felt like some weird dream. Like someone had decided to play a cruel trick on me as payback for ghosting her. Apart from that message this morning, I've not spoken to her since getting back from Greece, I said. She probably hates me for that. I wouldn't blame her. She'll get over it. People hook up on holiday all the time, only to lose touch once they return to reality. It's not like you owed her anything. That's the thing. I promised her a date. Like a real date, in London. Ian's eyes widened. He leaned back in his chair, brow furrowing. The colleague in him would tell me it didn't matter, business was business, and anything personal should be dealt with outside the office. The friend in him would call me a dick and say I fully deserved to experience the true extent of her anger. Now why would you promise her something like that if you never had any intention of following through? He somehow managed to avoid sounding too accusatory, instead seeming genuinely curious. I'd been battling the same thought for the past 3 weeks. What kind of bubble had I been living in over the summer? The Imogen Saunders experience. That kind of bubble. Her body had put me under a spell, and her tastes in the bedroom had kept me there. I had to ignore everything else that had influenced my decision to suggest we continue seeing each other in London. The late-night conversations. The early morning breakfasts. The days we spent in each other's company. The evenings we spent flirting. It truly had been an Imogen Saunders bubble. I didn't intend to lead her on, I said, pushing the straying thoughts from my mind. Situations change, don't they? Ian shrugged and let it slide. Regardless of all that, the two of you need to have some kind of conversation for closure, to make sure there are no ill feelings. Doesn't have to be a date. Probably better that it isn't, right? I need time to wrap my head around it first. I'm sure she does, too. And maybe I need to take back some of the HR stuff. Ian cocked an amused eyebrow at me. Concerned that other girls you've slept with will be hired here, too? My jaw clenched. Handing over control of the HR responsibilities was supposed to lessen my workload and give me more time to focus on strategy. Having Imogen here is going to distract me from that and no doubt cause all kinds of issues that I'll need to spend time managing. And what would you have done if you had known she was due to start here? I wouldn't have gone near her in Greece. My pull towards her had been undeniably strong, but knowing she was a future employee would still have overpowered that. I don't make the same mistake twice. Jason, we both know you're a control freak, but leave the HR stuff with a dedicated HR department. Hindsight is a great thing, but you've got enough on your plate. Let's just deal with this day by day. I sighed but didn't argue. Ian had been my best recruit without doubt, and there was nothing I didn't trust him with. I needed to apply that same level of trust to this. You're right. Thanks, mate. Ian offered a small smile and then stood up from his chair, smoothing down his suit. Just as he began to head back towards the lift, I called after him. How did you know it was her? Ian turned. Between her stunned reaction to meeting you and the fact she later referred to you as Jason despite only spending a few minutes up here. It didn't take much detective work. Oh, and she's called Imogen. That was a big clue. When Ian left the room, I opened my laptop lid again. It was an automatic reaction to being alone. I didn't actually look at it. My mind was focused on Imogen, wondering how I could get myself out of this mess. Maybe I wasn't giving her enough credit and she'd actually be fine with working in the same office. After all, Maya would be her direct manager. We could have as little to do with each other as we wanted. Not to mention Imogen's confidence knew no limits. I'd seen the way she could command a room, have a person hanging off her every word, entranced by her every movement. She'd settle in instantly, and I'd just be some loser who wasted her time on holiday. She was still a temptation, though, one that I hadn't managed to keep away from in Greece, no matter how many times she'd fed my addiction to her. Now I'd have to see her every day, knowing I couldn't touch her, suspecting that even talking to her would only add fuel to the intense attraction I felt. After 4 weeks of seeing her in swimwear, summer dresses, and minimal makeup, seeing her in business attire was surreal. A different version of the Imogen I'd spent time with in Greece. Yet equally enticing. It was as if someone had picked her up from Greece, given her a new appearance, and then placed her into my office as a test. Amongst all the uncertainty of how this would play out, one thing was for sure: if this was a test, I didn't rate my chances of passing. Thank you for reading Smile 20. I hope you all enjoyed the first chapter from Stafford's POV. The next chapter will take us back to their last day in Greece together. Thank you for all the support so far. I'm so appreciative of all your votes and comments. Sunlight streamed through the Venetian blinds, casting golden rays across Imogen's peaceful face to announce the beginning of a new day. To anyone nosy enough to peek into Jason Walter's luxury suite, the tan bodies intertwined in the queen-sized bed would appear to belong to a sleeping couple. Jason and Imogen weren't a couple, and they weren't sleeping, either, although neither of them wanted to accept that morning had finally arrived. They'd been awake since before dawn, spending hours exploring each other's bodies over and over again in an attempt to preserve the memory of their explosive summer and make the most of their remaining time in bed together. I should get up and shower. Jason spoke the words without any real conviction, his soft voice conveying reluctance as his fingers continued to trace patterns across Imogen's shoulders. Just stay another week, she said, her request muffled by the pillow in which she buried her face. I wish I could. I've already stayed longer than planned. Imogen rolled onto her back and gazed up at the tanned face of the man who'd taken control of her heart and her body over the summer. His hair was unruly from where she'd dragged her hands through it half an hour earlier, but his eyes remained tender. I know, she said with a sigh. I'm still amazed your awful boss let you do that. Miracles happen. Jason planted a soft kiss on her forehead and brushed strands of blonde hair away from her eyes. As he retracted his hand, the reddened scar on his inner wrist caught Imogen's eye, and she threaded her fingers through his. How's your wrist feeling this morning? Barely hurts. I think I'll survive. No lawsuit coming your way. Imogen grinned, squeezing his hand. At least my hair looked good last night. Yeah, I might have a burn that leaves a permanent scar, but at least your hair looked good. If it makes you feel better, I've burnt myself on those curling irons hundreds of times. Maybe next time you're getting ready in my bathroom, you can give me a heads up that they're still hot so I can avoid accidentally knocking them. Although she laughed, a knot twisted in Imogen's stomach. Jason had made several references to seeing her again back in London, but she couldn't help wondering whether he'd follow through with it once they'd both left this magical Greek bubble. Listen, I've been thinking. Imogen began, her voice betraying the trepidation she felt about broaching the topic of the future. If this was just a summer thing from your perspective, then you can tell me. I'd rather know now than go back to England and think we'll be carrying on with whatever we're doing. I can handle it. We've had this conversation. I've already told you that this is more than a summer thing to me. Jason's brow wrinkled as he trailed his fingers along her jaw. I don't want this to end here. Neither do I, but you've already said your boss is a nightmare and you rarely have a social life outside work. If you don't have time for a social life, then would you realistically have time for me? Jason searched her expression for anything that would give away how she truly felt. Although she seemed nervous bringing up the topic of life after the summer, she seemed to be telling the truth about handling a potential separation. Over the past few weeks, he'd seen many sides to Imogen Saunders, her passionate side, her risk-taking side, her sensitive side, and her playful side. He'd never seen her show any hint of vulnerability. Even now, nothing suggested she'd fall apart if he were to say they had no future together. I'd make time for you, he told her. A social life is a nice-to-have thing. You're something I need to have. Imogen cocked an eyebrow at him and smiled. You're a real smooth talker. You got a problem with that? Her smile widened but a twinkle glinted through her eyes. No, but I will track you down and give you hell if that turns out to be a lie. Doesn't sound much like handling it to me. That's because you'd have lied to me. If you'd have told me here, I'd have been fine. If you choose not to be honest here and then call things off back in the UK behind the safety net of a phone screen, then that's a dick move which I won't tolerate. Fuck. You're starting to scare me a bit. Maybe I really should get out now while I still can. Imogen grinned and slid her hands into Jason's hair, pulling his face down until his teasing smile met her own. Despite the tender conversation, the kiss burned with fiery passion until they broke away to catch their breaths. Jason dragged his mouth along her jaw, and Imogen groaned in pleasure as he nipped at her earlobe, heat pooling between her legs even though her body begged for a rest. "I'm crazy about you, Midge. I can't wait to take you out on a proper date." Jason's velvety tone did nothing to cool her down, and she twisted her head to capture his lips again. Over the summer, he'd learned exactly where she ached to be touched, kissed and teased. He could sense when she loved it rough and when she preferred it slow. Their tastes in the bedroom perfectly aligned, and their time together out of it was just as special. The thought of ever letting her go seemed insane. "Join me in the shower, let's have another replay of that night a few weeks ago." It was a command rather than a request, but Imogen couldn't help playing hard to get, even though the idea of being fucked under a steamy torrent of luxury water turned her on. "I told you that's for special occasions only," she said. "This morning is a special occasion. I was thinking more like your birthday. And I'm thinking I need as many memories of you as possible to keep me going until our first date. Maybe I should save it for our first date, then." She refused to give in. "Make sure you actually live up to your word and take me out. I can't wait to prove your cynical side wrong and treat you to the date of your life. And then, that night, I'm going to whisper 'I told you so' down your ear as I fuck you senseless on your sofa, in your bed, against your wall, under your shower. Until you beg me to stop and apologize for ever doubting me." After being locked in a captivating trance for several seconds, her mind filled with fantasies of a future with Jason, Imogen leapt out of bed and strode towards the bathroom. "Get out of bed. Your flight is in a few hours and we don't have time to lie around." With a genuine smile, Jason swung his legs over the side of the mattress and let his body carry him towards the place where his mind always strayed, Imogen Saunders. Thank you for reading Smile 20. For anyone wondering, their summer in Greece took place from the beginning until the end of August. Then the present-day chapters are from late September onwards. I hope you're enjoying the story so far. Ian had joked that the first days in a job are the easiest, but for me nothing had been harder than watching the man I'd grown to care for stride around the office without a glance in my direction. Even more frustrating than the lack of attention was the desire that coursed through me whenever I laid eyes on him. I still wanted him. I hated that my body refused to sync up with my head. The challenging workload that Maya thrust on my desk kept me distracted for the most part, bringing me up to speed with the inner workings of the business and sparing me no time for dwelling. I appreciated that she didn't feel the need to act as a babysitter. This job was an opportunity, and I had always intended to grab it by the horns and push myself to new heights. Maya enabled me to do just that. "I'm not usually one to pay compliments," she said to me on my third day, "but I'm seriously impressed with how you're picking this up." She slid my drafted blog copy across the desk towards me, her edits in bright red pen leaping off the page. "Looks like I've still got some way to go," I replied, glancing down at the numerous notes she'd made. "Imogen." She cocked an eyebrow at me and her lips curled upwards. "You could write the perfect piece and I'd still find something to critique." "Right. Good to know. What I mean is, writing is subjective. Look at my edits and see what you think. Maybe you don't agree with some of them, and that's fine. Trust your instincts. This is your piece. Not mine. Except you've been here for 3 years. I've been here for 3 days." Maya ran her tongue over her lips in thought, her deep purple lipstick not shifting. When she spoke again, she made me an offer that sounded much more like a command than a question. "How about you join the departmental meeting this afternoon? You can clearly rise to a challenge and that makes me want to push you." A departmental meeting, 3 days in? An intimidating thought, but too much of an opportunity to turn down. I was no coaster, nor naive enough to expect everything to fall in my lap. Jason knew things about me that could jeopardize my position here, and I refused to be a sitting duck. "Definitely. I'd love to," I said. Maya shot me the smallest hint of a smile, pride flooding her features. Maybe I was her protégé, a little project to mold and develop. If I did well, it looked good on her. I didn't care about that, though. I wanted to make her proud. I wanted to make me proud. "Anything I shouldn't say?" I asked Maya as I followed her down a corridor towards the boardroom. "Just one thing." She spun around to face me, and I came to an abrupt halt. A wave of her floral perfume collided with me, but I managed not to crash into her myself. "Don't call him Jason." "Excuse me? He prefers to go by Stafford? His surname?" Maya shrugged, her eyes flickering over my facial features as if looking for some sort of clue. For a moment, I felt as if she suspected I had something to hide. But that was ridiculous. Nobody knew about Jason and me, except Jason. Nobody knew how I'd lied my way into this role, except Jason. And if Maya did know, I doubt she'd be inviting me to departmental meetings. She'd be sitting tight, waiting for my inevitable dismissal, so she could move on to a different, more deserving employee. Only those close to him can get away with calling him Jason. I wouldn't want you to accidentally stick your foot in it. Right. Thanks. I assume Ian didn't mention it? Had Ian mentioned it? My first day had been a blur, a torrent of information that I tried to absorb. Despite that, I'd have remembered something as significant as Jason's name, particularly when I was already so sensitive to the fact it had apparently changed since our summer in Greece. Maybe he did and I forgot. If Maya could sense I was lying, she didn't call me out. Instead, she continued down the corridor. I followed, trying to get my head around calling my old lover by a new name that had been unknown to me up until 3 days ago. The atmosphere inside the boardroom felt relaxed as Maya and I took our seats. Ian sat towards the head of the table, talking football with a woman to his right, while the two men opposite me were engaged in deep conversation about a new Netflix series. Maya had grabbed the left hand of another colleague to inspect a beautiful diamond ring on her finger, immediately launching into questions about how the fiancé had proposed. "You'll have to get tips from Ian," she said. "Honestly, the detail that goes into planning a wedding." "I haven't even started thinking about the wedding," the woman replied, her beaming smile almost infectious. "I'm just enjoying the engagement." "I bet." My stomach flipped when Jason strode into the room, his tall and commanding presence holding my eyes captive. I'd expected his appearance to silence everyone. It didn't, though. The chatter merely died down, only stopping completely once he'd taken a seat at the head of the table and opened his notebook. He surveyed the room, his gaze landing on me. For the first time in 3 days, we locked eyes. His stare still lacked recognition, but it brought back a memory of him demanding I look into his eyes as I came. Clearing his throat, he gestured towards me. "For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of meeting her yet, we have a new starter among us. Imogen Saunders has joined the company within the editorial department." Everyone smiled and offered me polite nods. Being singled out when I already felt severely underqualified to be in the room at all did not help my conscience, but I forced a smile in return. The meeting started with each departmental head giving an update on the past week's events within their team. Maya had suggested I attend so as to push me, but I found myself benefiting from the vast amount of knowledge shared around the table. I'd been thrown in the deep end, and every piece of information I absorbed helped me to tread water. "We're not seeing much traction with the email marketing," Ian said. "Unsubscribes are at an all-time high and today marks the 3rd week without a click." "Any advice from editorial?" Jason asked, his eyes falling on Maya. "We're refreshing the content each week," she replied without a second's hesitation. "New subject lines, experimenting with the copy. We know it's been tough, and it's a priority for us." Ian nodded. "Editorial has been working closely with us. We've scheduled meetings each week to discuss next steps." I sensed an opportunity, and the words tumbled from my mouth before I gave myself the chance to second-guess. "If I may," I said, trying not to become psyched out when all pairs of eyes landed on me. "Perhaps I'm misunderstanding or jumping to conclusions, but is the email going out to the same audience each week?" If Ian was surprised at my contribution, he didn't show it. He also didn't speak to me in a patronizing way, which I'm sure would have been a temptation given that the new girl was attempting to question methods employed by longtime staff members. "We alternate each week," he replied. "Split our database in half, essentially, so we're not spamming." I wonder if it would be beneficial to only target an audience relevant to the content being promoted each week? Ian interlinked his fingers on the table in front of him, cocking an eyebrow in interest and gesturing for me to continue. "So, I imagine you have a record of all the purchases your customers have made. Let's say that one email promotion is about redesigning your living room. Is there a way you can split your database so that you're only sending that email to the customers who've recently purchased living room furniture, or recently sought your advice on decorating their living room?" Silence enveloped the table. Jason's eyes bore into my skull, but I refused to look at him. He'd only make me nervous. But when Ian pursed his lips together, I worried I'd said something stupid. "I'm just wondering if that would prevent people unsubscribing," I said, wanting to justify my suggestion before it was shot down. "If you're only sending them relevant content, they'd be more likely to read the email or click through. For example, I'm part of a reading community. I ignore the emails about genres I'm not keen on, but I almost always click through when I see something that does match my interests." "I think your suggestion makes perfect sense," Maya said. "We'd be foolish not to try it. Right, Ian?" "You're absolutely right," Ian replied, leaning back in his chair and shooting an easy smile in my direction. "It'll take some manual work on the database, but the potential benefits would far outweigh the labor." "Feel free to come again, Imogen," another man chimed in, prompting a few laughs around the table. "Sometimes a fresh perspective is all it takes," Jason said. "Thank you for your contribution, Imogen. And, joking aside, you are welcome to pass on any further suggestions that you feel would be useful." Despite the polite and supportive message behind his words, the tone of delivery felt detached and formal. It was like a different man sat before me, not the same one who'd laughed with me, teased me, tortured me with pleasure and then confessed his deep feelings towards me. Jason Walters was gone. Maybe he'd never truly existed. My fantasy of a future built on the foundations of an amazing summer also needed to disappear. It was over. "Hey, Imogen," Ian said at the end of the meeting when everyone stood to leave. "You got a moment?" I hung back, not allowing my eyes to drift over Jason, who slowly packed away his laptop and notebook. "That took some real courage," Ian said to me. "Maya brought you here for exposure and you sure as hell exposed yourself." The words hung in the air between the three of us, yet the double meaning would only be noticed by two. "I'm here to learn and grow," I replied. "No point sitting back and coasting along, is there?" Partway through telling me that he appreciated my attitude, Ian's phone rang. He shot me an apologetic smile and then hurried from the room. For the first time since the summer, Jason and I were alone together. Despite the many things I wanted to say, and the frustrations desperate for an outlet, I bit my tongue and gathered my notebook, pen and glass of water. Just as I was heading for the door, however, he spoke. "Maya seems to be working you hard already, then." I froze, my hand already stretched towards the door handle. A treacherous part of me loved the opportunity to have a conversation with him. The more rational side resented it. I couldn't avoid it, though. Through some twisted coincidence, he was my boss now. All feelings aside, I needed to at least give the illusion of respecting him. "I'd hate to think she wasn't," I replied, curling my fingers around the handle for support as I swung my gaze across to him. The cool metal chilled my palm, and I tried to concentrate on that sensation rather than the ache that settled within my body at the sight of Jason in a crisp suit, his dark hair neatly combed and begging to be ruffled. "And how are you getting on in general?" he asked. "Fine." I hadn't intended to be so short, but the majority of my energy was focused on resisting the temptation to stride forwards and pull his mouth down to mine. In my head, my fingers were already unbuttoning his silk waistcoat, peeling away the layers of his suit to reveal the toned muscles hidden beneath that white shirt. "It was a shock to see you, Imogen." At last, the acknowledgement came. Yet it still took me by surprise, and my hand clenched the handle with added pressure. I couldn't do it. I couldn't have this conversation with him in the office when I'd been trying so hard to let go of the memories from summer. I needed to detach myself from the situation and see him purely as a stranger rather than a man who knew every inch of my body. I needed to ignore the emotions he stirred within me. Emotions based on a guy who apparently didn't exist. "We're not doing this here," I said. "Then let's do it later. I promised you a date, after all." Anger slammed into me, hitting me full force like a dam releasing a flood of imprisoned water. How dare he bring up his promise of a date? A promise that we both knew he hadn't kept. "You've got to be kidding me." I let out a bitter laugh. "I gave you my word. And I don't break promises." I released the handle and took a step towards him, rage blurring the vision of his lying, handsome face. As I edged closer, the familiar scent of his aftershave lingered in the air between us, almost tricking my brain into thinking we were back in his suite together, kissing on the bed. Or in the hotel's bar, grinding to music and tipping back shots. Or opposite one another in a restaurant, flirting away the minutes until we could be alone again. I stopped. "You had 3 weeks to keep that promise." I only ask for one thing from you. Honesty. You couldn't even do that. What's that supposed to mean? His brow wrinkled. You know exactly what I mean. And I was serious about not doing this here. I turned back towards the door, but his voice remained calm, sending chills through me that counteracted the warmth from his presence. Then meet me this weekend. Let's get everything out in the open. Voice our frustrations so we can move on. We need to clear the air if we're going to work together. I can't let this come in the way of my business. I impressed myself by keeping calm. But I also made sure my tone remained ice cold when I replied. Jason, I have absolutely no intention of getting in your way. I'd much prefer to stay out of it. Before he could respond, I yanked on the handle and left the room, adrenaline pumping through my body mixed with an infuriating amount of desire that I couldn't shift, no matter how hard I tried. Thank you for reading Smile 20. Please remember to hit the star button to vote if you enjoyed the chapter. I've loved reading your comments so far and appreciate all the support. Less than 3.
A couple of blocks away from the office, a small bar hid itself away from the chaos of the main London streets. I'd stumbled across it one day, many years back, and hadn't visited another one since. I liked that it was off the beaten track and didn't attract the usual crowds of tourists, stag doss or socializing office workers. Quiet and unassuming, I could drink there in peace. So, on the nights when I didn't go to the gym, I would head into the bar for one drink, sometimes two if I'd had a tough day. Just like the gym, I did it to switch off. Not that it truly worked, but it was a habit, nonetheless. On the Friday of Imogen's first week, I stayed longer than normal. The bartender no longer asked for my order, instead pouring the Macallan into a glass as soon as I drifted through the doorway. In a city with millions of people, where I only knew a small handful, there was something comforting about the simple action of a barman being familiar enough with me to pour a drink without needing to ask. Nursing the drink in one hand, I stared at my phone in the other. My fingers hovered over a number that I'd not yet pressed to dial. I needed advice, even though I knew the answer to my dilemma was obvious. There was only one real outcome to the situation. After downing the rest of the drink, I jabbed at the screen and raised the phone to my ear. Typically for her, it rang several times before she answered, her husky voice having an instant calming effect. To what do I owe the pleasure, late on a Friday night? It's 8 o'clock, I said. Your social life is clearly suffering if you think this is late. Sasha chuckled. You're moodier than usual. Bad day. Bad week. I hope you're not expecting me to cheer you up in my special way. Because that ship has sailed for you and me, I'm afraid. Sasha, that ship was never even in the port. I'd met Sasha Hinshaw in this same bar, 2 years ago. Despite her undeniable beauty and calm exterior, I'd seen straight through her. One of the things that made my company so successful was my ability to keep tabs on competitors. Sasha worked for my biggest rival, a local interior design firm called Montgomery's. It had been no coincidence that she'd ended up in this little unknown bar, sat next to me. I'd called her out on it, and we'd then had a nice evening together, agreeing not to discuss business. Even though we were competitors, we'd become friends, our taste for candid conversations and intense gym sessions drawing us together. Nothing had ever happened, and nothing ever would happen. But I valued her friendship, probably more than she realized. You okay? Concern replaced her playful attitude and I decided not to waste either of our times. I accidentally slept with an employee. Shit. Been there. Done that. I rolled my eyes. You slept with your boss and got a promotion out of it. Not quite the same thing. You know, Jason, I'm genuinely happy that you acknowledge my sexual expertise despite never having experienced it firsthand, but we both know I earned this position. Maybe if you stopped being so snarky then I might actually feel like offering you some advice. Apologies. I caught the eye of the bartender and nudged my glass across the counter. Needing no further instructions, he refilled the tumbler. So which part of having sex with an employee was an accident? She asked. I bit my tongue at the automatic retort to her facetious question. Sasha accepted no excuses when it came to sex. In her eyes, it was a choice that two people made. She wouldn't share my view of it being accidental. The part where I found out she, Imogen, was our new copywriter after I'd spent the whole summer fucking her. Ah. Exactly. So how many times? I didn't count. That many, huh? Her husky chuckle vibrated against my ear. You lucky bastard. Well, this has been great. Thanks for the invaluable advice. Sasha laughed again. Oh, come on. Don't be like that. I gulped back a mouthful of my freshly refilled drink but barely registered the burning liquid trickling down my throat. If only I hadn't become so accustomed to the sensation of it. Maybe then it would have distracted me from thoughts of Imogen peeling off her business attire to reveal the raunchy underwear that she'd surprised me with one evening in Greece. Let me ask you a different question, then, Sasha said, the seriousness returning to her voice. I wasn't in a joking mood and she'd probably picked up on that. If she hadn't turned out to be an employee, would you have carried on with her? Probably. We had a great time together. But it sounds like you hadn't seen her between your holiday and the morning she started the job. Once again, I bit back the defensive response that instinctively tried to emerge. I could see Sasha's argument but refused to give her the satisfaction. I feel like you're trying to make a point, so just come out and say it. If you genuinely wanted to be with her, then why hadn't you reached out since getting back from your holiday? She asked. My explanation got lodged in my throat. I'd been busy. I'd had catching up to do. I'd been consumed with work. Each morning, I'd woken up at 5 and put on a suit to get a head start on the day. My evenings had been spent eating takeout food in front of my laptop whilst trawling through spreadsheets and presentations. No matter how I spun it, Sasha wouldn't relate. She was the queen of juggling priorities. Somehow, she'd managed to secure a successful career and a serious relationship, simultaneously, which both intertwined. I live a different life here, I said instead. I'm different. She probably wouldn't even like the real me. Half the shit I told her was a lie and she knows that now. A lie because you were trying to be someone else. I'd gone there to escape. I stumbled into a hole that I didn't realize I'd been digging because I never intended to fall so deep. You know what I think? She asked. Hardly ever. I think you should be a writer with words like that. Hey, maybe Imogen can teach you a thing or two. You're the least supportive friend I have, you know that? I'm the only friend you have, Jason. I sighed, partly wanting to end the call but also knowing her words were true. For all her brutal truths, I could depend on her for honesty no matter what. You coming down for the awards ceremony? I changed the subject. Of course. I need to be there to support my man. I can't tell if you're talking about me or your boyfriend. Sasha chuckled again and made a joke about splitting her time evenly between Alistair and me. Again, juggling. I wasn't expecting to pick up a prize in the annual awards ceremony. Since opening a new office in Manchester, Sasha's company had seen record growth. The evening still presented an opportunity to network, suss out the competition and take a night off from real work, though. Coming from a friend and not a business rival, you deserve to win, Sash. And if you do, that pride should fall on your shoulders. Alistair has done a great job, but you're the one running things in Manchester. Lots of people in the industry are whispering your name at the moment. Thanks, Jason. That means a lot. As a businessman, I'd be disappointed to see the award go to my main competitor. As a friend, though, nothing would make me happier. And maybe it was about time I started putting people before business. Or maybe that was just my body justifying its attraction towards someone I couldn't have. Thank you for reading Smile 20. Please remember to hit the star button to vote if you're enjoying the story so far.
Will you please stop pacing? You're stressing me out.
You're stressed?
I said to Leo, who lay on our sofa with his eyes shut, looking anything but stressed. I'm sorry that my sex life, love life and work life hanging in the balance is an inconvenience to you.
Leo scoffed.
Yeah, because having a hot guy beg to take you on a date is a real nuisance. I didn't rise to his sarcastic comment, knowing the bickering would go back and forth relentlessly if I pursued it. Leo had been a close friend for years, a partner in all senses of the word at various points during our lives. I'd kept him in the loop during my time in Greece, I'd cried on his shoulder when I got back from Greece, and now I moaned his ear off about the potential consequences of revisiting Greece. Other friends might remind me of the hurt I'd suffered over the past few weeks, warning me away from entertaining Jason's offer of a date. Not Leo. If it really was as good as you say, then surely you owe it to yourself to have this date? He'd said as we discussed it over dinner. It's not a date. It's dinner to clear the air. And besides, he's my boss. He was your fuck buddy long before he was your boss, Midge. You need to get this out of your system. Even if nothing comes of it, then at least you've got closure. Leo was right, but then he'd always had an infuriating knack for being logical in times of crisis. Nothing fazed him. When I'd walked in on him with another guy, he just told me to either get into bed or get out of the room. When we failed a dance exam that we'd spent months training for, I'd hold myself up in my room. Leo had simply said we hadn't worked hard enough and that the better couple had won. When he'd caught the girl he'd been seeing cozied up with one of our mutual friends on Instagram, he'd shrugged it off and said there was no point wasting his emotions on a person who had so little regard for them. His even-headed approach to life's little dramas had inspired me over the years. It would be easy to take the stubborn path and refuse his advice. It would also be foolish. And that's how I found myself pacing up and down our living room, having decided to meet Jason after all. Jason had chosen an independent, family-run restaurant, hidden down a street I'd never heard of, in a part of London I'd never visited. It had no website, not even a Facebook page. The TripAdvisor reviews raved about the Greek food, though. I wanted to avoid being the first to arrive, having to sit there and wait for him to grace me with his presence, as if to remind me that he was a busy man in real life who didn't have time for girls like me. As it happened, Google Maps had my back. That little unknown street sent me on a wonderful tour of that unfamiliar part of London. I didn't even realize I'd been going in circles until a man stuck his head outside his shop and asked if I was okay. I'd walked past his door 3 times, apparently. When I did manage to locate the restaurant, I was half an hour late. I expected Jason to have left. After all, he was busy. He had a company to run. Yet my eyes landed on him the second I stepped through the door, his presence leaping out and capturing my attention before I'd even been shown to the table. He sat in the corner, dressed in a pale blue shirt with chinos, and immediately rose from his chair as soon as he saw me. For a brief moment, he wasn't my boss. He looked like Jason Walters. No tie. No jacket. No waistcoat. Just normal Jason Walters, and I could have cried with relief. I'm glad you came. His deep voice, all soft and smooth, triggered a flicker of heat between my thighs. One large hand reached towards me, before quickly dropping back to his side, like he'd thought better of it. Mouth dry with nerves, I wet my lips and watched his eyes flick down to track the movement of my tongue. I pulled out my chair and hooked my bag over the back of it. It gave me a tiny break from the weight of his intense stare, but then my gaze found its way back to him, like a metal snapping onto a magnet. We sat down in sync with each other. Time to get this back on track before I got sucked under his spell again. I agree there are things we should discuss, I said. And that's the only reason I'm here. Jason blinked, his eyes widening with what looked suspiciously like hurt. But he'd already mugged me off once and I refused to fall for it again. Midge, please. Don't call me that. My words rushed out with a ferocity that chilled even me, despite them coming from my own mouth. He sighed and leaned back in his chair, casting his gaze across the restaurant. Released from his intense eyes, the ones that held a summer of memories for me, I allowed myself the opportunity to scan his body again, noticing how his biceps strained against the fabric of his shirt. The top few buttons were undone and revealed a tiny strip of his bronzed chest. I wanted to touch it, to press my own against it, like I'd done so many times before. I understand why you're upset with me, Imogen. Do you? Of course. You put your trust in me and I let you down. I pressed my lips together to prevent myself from lashing out, counting to 5 in my head before speaking. Let me down? You think I'm upset because you let me down? Don't flatter yourself. I've been let down plenty of times before you, Jason. Or whatever the fuck your real name is. How do I know what else you've lied about? His lips parted, then flattened into a thin line. The penny had dropped. Of course I was upset that he'd let me down, but I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing that I had trusted him. I'd given him so many opportunities to keep our fling as a summer romance, and he'd insisted we continue it in London. So naturally I'd got my hopes up. Why wouldn't I when I'd given him an easy way out and he hadn't taken it? Without a word, Jason reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Leaving already? I hadn't expected the date to be smooth sailing, but I didn't think he'd walk out so early on. After plucking out a pale pink card, he tossed it across the table towards me. I caught it before it skidded off the edge, turning it over to see a photo of his face on the left-hand side and his name on the right. Walters. Mr. Jason Stafford. I stole a peek at his date of birth, too, just in case he'd lied about that. He hadn't. Sliding it back towards him, I folded my arms and narrowed my eyes, ready to launch into a defense should he challenge me. He didn't. Stafford is your middle name? He shook his head. Not exactly. My parents married after I was born. Stafford is my mother's maiden name. It should be double-barreled, but for most of my life I've just gone by Walters. Then I found myself caught up in a bit of a scandal in my previous job, and I stopped being Jason Walters and started being Stafford. Nobody knows me as Jason Walters nowadays. Nobody apart from you. Up until that, I'd been poised to ask about the scandal, but his confession that only I knew his real name distracted me, sending my thoughts soaring in a different direction. And then a comment Maya had made sprung to the forefront of my mind. Nobody calls you Jason, either. Apart from Ian. I cocked an eyebrow. And why is that? Because I consider him a friend rather than just a colleague. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Jason averted his eyes downwards, showing weakness for the first time since we'd reconnected. Instead of answering, he suggested we order. Too many questions still needed addressing, so I agreed. I had a bad experience in my previous job, Jason said after the waiter left, volunteering the information without me asking. I was young, 17 or 18, and I got involved with the boss. The boss? Yes, and not just my boss. The boss of the whole company. It was only sex. There was nothing romantic about it, but I think that made it worse. Made what worse? Well, firstly I was much younger than her. And secondly, she was married. Being a horny teenager, I continued to pursue her and then couldn't help bragging about it. She ended up being fired. And divorced. Jason delivered the story without emotion, as if he were talking about someone else and not a deeply personal matter from his own past. She was fired? Divorced I could understand, she cheated on her husband. But fired? He scrubbed a palm over the light stubble lining his jaw. Technically she resigned, but it was clear she didn't have a choice. It brought the company into disrepute. The affair was bad, but having an affair with a teenager when she held a position of authority just sealed the deal. And what happened to you? Nothing. Again, he delivered the answer in a matter-of-fact fashion, as though detached from the situation. Perhaps he was. After all, it happened several years ago, and he appeared to have made changes to his life since then. So why did you swap your name? Because although I didn't receive any disciplinary action for it, the damage to my reputation had a huge impact. I left that job and struggled to find another in the same industry. She had a lot of connections and was powerful. That's what had attracted me to her. She blamed me because I was the one who'd pursued it. I snorted at that. Right. So, she was incapable of making the decision to cheat on her husband herself? He shrugged. Either way, finding a job was tough. I was seen as unreliable, uncommitted, either so career-hungry that I'd sleep my way to the top, or so unambitious that I'd rather sleep with colleagues than concentrate on my work. So, you changed your name and started your own company? Yes. You know what the ironic thing is? If you'd have known I was your employee, I'd have understood why you didn't get in touch after Greece. You wouldn't want to make the same mistake and this time be in the other pair of shoes. It's not to do with making a mistake, Imogen. It doesn't matter, Jason. Until this week, you didn't know I'd be working for you. You just chose to forget about me and not get in touch. I didn't forget about you. Just chose not to send a message, then. At least not until 3 weeks later, anyway. I didn't say that, though. I wouldn't want to risk sounding petty, or worse, sounding as if I still pined for him. You could have been more honest about your intentions, that's all, I said instead. He arched an eyebrow, his forearms resting on the table as he leaned across to bring our faces closer together. You want to talk about honesty? You got this job based on a degree that you don't even have. I held his gaze, still refusing to show weakness, but he backed me into a corner. What could I say? Sacrifice my pride to appeal to his compassionate side? I knew he had won, although you wouldn't be blamed for not believing it to look at him now, face like stone, eyes giving nothing away. If you're going to fire me, just do it, Jason. He sighed and shook his head to himself, leaning back in his chair and folding his arms. With his eyes fixed across the restaurant, I took a moment to compose myself. Up until that point, I'd felt like the victim, as though I'd been conned at worst, or mugged off at best. Jason's mistakes in this did not outweigh my own, though. I could accuse him of being a fraud all I liked, tricking me into thinking we had something that would last, but he was no more of a fraud than me. Lying on my CV. Lying in my interview. So desperate for a job after blowing my student loan that I hadn't worried about the consequences of my deceit catching up with me. When we were sitting by the pool and you told me about dropping out of uni, I didn't judge you. In fact, I admired you. And this puts me in a difficult position. I know it does. But I didn't want tonight to be about work. I wanted it to be about us. We can postpone the university conversation until Monday morning, but it will be a conversation, Imogen. I can't ignore it. I've turned a blind eye up to now because I was still coming to terms with having you around, but I need to be fair. I'd only expect you to be fair. And don't, for 1 second, think that this evening is going to have an impact on that conversation. I have to separate it and treat you like any other member of staff. Of course. I reached for the wine bottle to top up my glass, needing the liquid courage. Foolishly, I'd expected to have the upper hand. The tables had well and truly turned. So aside from the lies that we're both guilty of, is there anything else on your mind? Anything that will help to clear the air? He asked. His detached tone had returned, as if he knew we needed to have the conversation, but the reality of us being boss and employee still hung over us. I just want to know why. Although a vague statement, it didn't require any further clarification. Jason considered his answer for a long while, which didn't settle my nerves or my anger. I thought I made it clear that I'd have been happy carrying on or calling it quits. I continued when he still didn't speak. I only wanted honesty from you. If you'd had no intention of carrying on, then you should have just told me, and I'd have been fine. Imogen, I didn't intend to lead you on if that's how you feel. I meant every word I said to you in Greece. I wanted to carry on. So, why didn't you? The strength in my voice wavered. I felt it in my throat, a small lump threatening to expose my vulnerability. I hoped he hadn't noticed. How would I even know if he was telling the truth now? It could be another web of lies, designed to placate me so that I wouldn't ruffle any feathers at work. Or cause another scandal. Can I ask you a question first? I frowned, not impressed that he seemed to be avoiding the question. If answering his own sped this up, though, then I was happy to comply. Go ahead. Where do you see us going from here? Whatever I'd been expecting, it hadn't been that. Was it an attempt to swerve the conversation in a different direction? A distraction? A time-wasting tactic? A trick? I think there's too much between us for you and me to be anything more than boss and employee, I said, opting for the safest response. Why does that matter? Because I need to know how you feel before I tell you the truth. Thank you for reading Smile 20. This story will soon be available on Ream, a subscription platform designed for reading. Keep the book in your Wattpad library or follow me to stay updated.